Suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I would say.
And you think you're going to get in on that?
No, but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, and if it was the 12 Greek gods, then I would have more truck with it, because the Greeks they didn't pretend not to be human in their appetites and in their capriciousness and in their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all-seeing, all-wise, all-kind, all-beneficent. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac, totally selfish. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable. So, atheism is not just about not believing there's a God, but on the assumption that there is one. What kind of God is he? It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, your life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living in.
Thought I'd bring up again, or bring out again, a little Gnostic / Marcionite wisdom from Stephen Fry to get you in the mood. Proverbs 9:10 does say, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The quote is very true, I contend, and so would probably Stephen. But not in the funny way of of the Lord, I've got No. Once you've really and earnestly faced Yaldabaoth and all of his earthly slaves in the establishment and empty works, you will be filled with terror, and you will commence your journey towards Sophia and her cosmic plan of redemption. You probably already have, and that's why you are here.
You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
We don't need him.
We don't agree.
Fuck damnation, man. Fuck redemption. We are God's unwanted children. So be it.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West. Always through the God above God-Dad Cam. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything, including your finding the mystery that works for you and only you. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. Especially in these almost 8 years, saving divine sparks one pink beam at a time.
Yes, these are bruises from fighting. Yes, I'm comfortable with that. I am enlightened.
I have just finished the Gnostic Countercultures Conference at Rice University. If you missed the announcement on various channels, I was invited to be the media demon for that event, finally meeting past guests and some of the greatest scholars on the Gnostics. That included April DeConnick, Jeff Kripal, Harold Bloom, Eric Davies, and more. What an honor it was, pregnant with the latest scholarship on the Gnostic heresy, Philip K. Dick, comic books, sci-fi, Judas, and so much more. Thank you very much, Matthew and April, and all those who made it happen.
Devils! Blasphemers! Pray to your heathen god, while in the Lord's name we cast you out.
Check out the GodAboveGod.com and our social media for news, videos, and photos of the Gnostic countercultures, and how it truly represented and exemplified the original intention of this show. That is, to connect the ancient Gnostics to a modern, liberating meaning. And what liberating meaning we are doing together, even now, oh you true seeker warriors. Building vast futures of light and universes of possibility. We're gonna do so many wonders together in this eternal beginning of wisdom. I just know it. I just know it.
A new age has begun. An age of freedom.
I am still Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, that smell of colitas rising up through the toxic air of a world gone mad by the mad nightmares of a mad god and his mad angels and their paradises by the dashboard light. Mad, mad, mad. Or as Philip K. Dick said, and it relates to the establishment and their gods, insanity is not hubris, not pride. It is the inflation of the ego to its ultimate. Confusion between him who worships and that which is worshipped. Man has not eaten God. God has eaten man.
Our impulses are being redirected. We are living in an artificially induced state of consciousness that resembles sleep.
Fear of the Lord, I say to you, as I come in my meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world. David Brackey had a very interesting insight in one of his lectures that I'm listening to at the website The Great Courses, which was actually a present from this week's Astral guest. Anywho, Brackey points out a huge difference about Gnosis to other mystic disciplines, and I've pointed out many before in past episodes. You see, in most Eastern or meditative faiths, one contemplates to go beyond the mind. In Gnosticism, one meditates to actually go into the mind.
Never recreate places from your memory. Always imagine new places.
You gotta draw from stuff you know, right?
With never entire areas.
Why not?
Because building a dream from your memory is the easiest way to lose your grasp on what's real and what is a dream.
Is that what happened to you?
It's a fierce epic of self-knowledge. In Gnosis, one contemplates the mind to connect it to the mind of the unknown God, calibrate it, fix that thinking that went wrong, as they say in both AA and A Course in Miracles. The pleroma is not the fullness of matter, but the fullness of the thoughts of the creative intelligence that is beyond matter. Gnosis is similar to Plato and the Hellenistic notion of contemplations, upward into the world of ideas. Except like in the Symposium, the old Greeks contemplated the bodies of young male teenagers and not the mind. Oh, those perverts.
You like movies about gladiators? Have you ever been in a Turkish prison?
Of course, there is some mysticism involved. And in the end, the experience of the alien worshippers, as we are known, to the alien god is ultimately personal and sublime. This quote from the Nag Hammadi Library's allogenes, Greek for stranger, something we are also, puts how Gnosis works. I withdrew from the world to search deeper into myself, and the moment I came to know myself, I was filled with revelation. In a state of blessedness, I merged with myself. Yes, I came to stand and rest in the silence and stillness. Through an unknowing knowledge, I came to know the one who exists in me, the one who is unknowable, the one who, himself, eternally stands at rest in silence and stillness.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
As I've said, the distance to our inner or true selves, the daemon or nous, is the same as our physical distance to the nearest star. Yet what a journey it is, and the Gnostics, like the Neoplatonists and Kabbalists of old, wrote about these flights of the soul through the spheres of reality and unreality. They certainly had to speak to other entities, gatekeepers of other dimensions, and perhaps even some archons. Their scriptures bestow the maps and passwords to the supernal realms, and Bracky even grants some of the rituals of the Sethians in his lectures. Our astral guest on this early April, the year of our Demiurge 2015, will bestow some significant lessons, rituals, and the Gnostic perspective on the spirit world around us. That is Scott Smith, and sorry I'm introducing you so late, who honors the virtual Alexandria for the second blasphemy, all centered on his incendiary yet penetrating book, God Reconsidered, searching for truth in the battle between atheism and religion.
If you could be either God's worst enemy or nothing, which would you choose?
Yes, the spirit world is very busy, and it's always sending tweets and Instagrams, and we will get closer to deciphering their missives. Scott will as well grant some insights on modern Gnosticism, as the good people at Gnostic countercultures did. The future of Sackless' demise is so bright, we gotta wear shades. Even during this Easter season, where the material form of Jesus is plunged into the triumphant dark by the powers and principalities. This is going to happen, as surely as a black character being killed off in The Walking Dead.
I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there. Your support is essential if we are to continue growing this eternal soundtrack of the counterculture. There are linkies at the God Above God Dad Cam, including the Patreon campaign and my reality-dispending, mind-expanding books such as Voices of Gnosticism or Stargazer. Oceanic appreciation to those who support this Red Pill cafeteria on a weekly basis. Our audience continues to grow, and that is blowing the bandwidth of the iTunes account. But out of the tens of thousands of hits every month, little has translated into support. So please help out so I can keep that corporate bitch open, which has been a problem of late.
You make me happy.
Before I end my devilish drivel, I would like to mention that there will be some ethereal ambient music played after our interview with Scott Smith. It will be from a true seeker warrior and paladin of Sophia artist. His name is MJ Dawn, an electronic musician widely known for his work in the hard rock band Mudvayne. MJ Dawn is also a Gnostic researcher, exploring the realms of where magic and science meet, just like we do here at Aeon Byte. Check out his and other artists' music at atmoworks.com. Don't miss this meditation to the higher mind after the interview. And let us meditate our minds to the mind of the alien God with the interview. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You no longer have to be afraid as we travel together on this dark odyssey through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy, all the way to the farthest shores of imagination, into the warm embrace of Sophia. This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having back Scott Smith, author of God Reconsidered, Searching for Truth in the Battle Between Atheism and Religion. How are you doing today, Scott?
All ready to be grilled by the Inquisition.
Well, it's something like that. I'd like to think it more we're going to have a nice stew of different modern Gnostic ideas, and hopefully it will help the listener find their own Gnosis, find their own bliss. In our first interview, Scott, back in September, you gave some lengthy responses about your background on God Reconsidered. There was certainly some feedback, especially the nice comments on YouTube. But let's do a short summary of your key points before we get into some new material.
Yeah, and let me just say to your long-suffering listeners here that, at the time, the book wasn't out, and as we're recording this, it's at the printer, so hopefully it's going to be on Amazon soon. But I know I had some feedback from listeners who, of course, hadn't read the book and weren't really familiar with my arguments in the book. We had to treat these superficially. But, I welcome posting on your YouTube channel. Also, there's a godreconsidered.com website. There's a Facebook page. I welcome postings. I will answer or respond to everybody. And you have quite the diverse audience. I had outraged atheists and outraged Buddhists. So with that in mind, let me just kind of briefly say how I came to write the book, because it will put it in context. I've had some mystical experiences and also some extraordinary synchronicities throughout my life. I grew up Mormon, and anybody who's read Harold Bloom knows that the Mormons have a kind of Gnosticism in certain ways, and they are perhaps the leading Christian heresy today. They'd like you to believe that they're just Baptists who don't drink alcohol or coffee, but they do believe human beings can become gods, and a number of other ideas that don't go down well with Southern Baptists. And so I grew up in that kind of environment, and one of the things I discovered at 17 that led to my first dark night of the soul was the question of animal suffering. Because animals, as Monty would agree, are pretty innocent, and yet, we've tortured and killed and eaten them. And so I finally realized what was going on when I was 17, and prayed for an answer and received one. It turned out, the modern Mormons never talk about it, but it has one of the most reverence for life-oriented theologies, and that led to my writing my first book in 1980 called, well, it wasn't really my first book, but the first book on religion in 1980 called Animals and the Gospel, and eventually that led to The Soul of Your Pet, which is still on Amazon, and it looks at the evidence for the afterlife of souls. So that was kind of the context for my spiritual search. Now, what happened that led directly to the book, God Reconsidered, is that I discovered the UFO business in the late 1980s, and this really led to a crisis of faith. How did this fit into the idea of human beings, being placed here on Earth, and, we're going to learn lessons and hopefully go back to God. And in January 1989, I had a 2-hour mystical experience that I now understand was the central Gnostic insight into the duality of the universe. And the Mormons would actually add to that conversation on the side of Monty to say that it appears that as far back as even the gods would know, consciousness is composed of good and evil. There is an eternal struggle between the dark and the light. And that's what I learned through direct knowledge in a mystical experience. And the next year, I had the privilege of interviewing the guy I regard as the greatest parapsychologist ever, Scott Rogo, R-O-G-O, wrote 30 books, an incredible guy. And I did his final and one of his very, very few interviews for Fate magazine. A few weeks later, he was murdered. And he really kind of set me on the path to discover the truth. And he told me quite frankly, after 25 years of being a parapsychologist, he says, I'm more confused than ever about, what the big answers are. So ultimately, that search from 1989, 1990 led to my discovery of Gnosticism. I didn't know what it was when I had this mystical experience. And that came about in 2005 when I discovered Stefan Heller's book on Gnosticism. And so that's what led to it. And what I relate in the book is the process of kind of sorting through all the mainstream religions. And I want to share with readers why I found them to have inadequate answers to the mysteries of life.
We do want to get to how your book has been received in some other issues, but here's a question that has come about to me many times, and of course I have my own answers. So when somebody comes to you, Scott, and basically says, hey dude, is the Demiurge and the Archons real? What do you say to them?
What I would say to those who wonder about that is, first of all, as St. Paul said, we see through a glass darkly, and we shouldn't get too hung up in having all the answers. You can argue, and Heller basically says, that the different viewpoints aren't necessarily incompatible. It's like different parts of the elephant that we're feeling. But I would say this. The one thing that is very, very clear to me, having done a pretty thorough global search for truth and the history of religions, is that the world is shamanistic, that there are good spirits, bad spirits, and neutral or lost spirits. And so I would say I believe in a shamanistic Gnosticism. And I think the evidence is that there are spirits which attempt to manipulate our thinking about religion. There's a lot of that in the UFO phenomenon. And some of them wish us harm. And I would say that the concept of a spirit who is greater than human and yet ignorant of God actually has a parallel with us. I mean, how many people in the world aren't sure or are extremely negative about the notion that there's even a supernatural realm? So that makes perfect sense that you could have a being in another realm. In fact, the great medium George Anderson once asked the spirits, and I think there's a lot of evidence this guy's genuine. He said, is there such a thing as reincarnation? And the spirit said, well, we've heard there is. So if you're dead and you're not sure about reincarnation, it means that we little mortals have a little more to learn. Now, on the other point of why would some spirit wish us harm? I mean, what sense does it make that there could be some great evil spirit, a devil-like figure? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. Let's assume for the moment that there is a plane of existence or being, and we have had our Hitlers, Stalins, and Mao Zedongs. Why should it be any different among the spirits? The shamans say that there are many evil spirits. So I would say that it doesn't really matter if the demiurge is an abstract force like the impersonal God of Gnosticism and many other religions. The bottom line is that there are evil forces which don't wish us well, and anybody who thinks otherwise is naive.
And the question would be, who exactly are the spirits? Are they us? Are they other entities? For example, I've been enjoying the lectures that you shared with me on David Brackey, and I'm very grateful for them, and I urge the viewer to listen to them. They're great. And he talks about how the Valentinians thought that we had a counterpart, a daemon, a higher self that lived in the spirit world. And oddly enough, this counterpart was always female. Oh, those sexist Gnostics. And we had to join with that female counterpart. So, in your view, who are the spirits?
Yes, excellent question. And Mormons would say, and I have a great deal of respect for Mormon theology, it's extremely sophisticated, contrary to the church's propaganda and the naivete of most current Mormons. But they would say, listen, consciousness has been around forever, and the purpose of the gods is to take that consciousness, develop it into a spirit body form, and put it on Earth to go through earthly experiences. The shamans simply say, they don't really necessarily try to provide grand origin theories, but the one thing, like I say, I am convinced of is there are many different types of entities, shall we say. To what extent they're impersonal, personal, where do you draw the line on spirits? Do cockroaches have spirits? I'm a kind of conservative in saying, let's look at the best evidence. In my book, The Soul of Your Pet, I certainly show there's a lot of evidence that the higher animals like dogs and cats and horses and birds and so forth have spirits. And it's surprisingly persuasive, actually. So there are spirits. You could say the universe is animistic or shamanistic. Exactly what the cosmic pecking order is really kind of what the debate is about. But some of them appear to be lost, which would explain a lot of these kind of ghost stories where they're rattling around, where they died and so forth. But if anybody doesn't think there are spirits, I have a whole chapter on afterlife in God Reconsidered, in which I weigh the atheists' arguments against this evidence and show it wanting. What exactly happens after we die is a matter of debate, and I would argue that death is the most important part of liberation. And I also am a very big skeptic about reincarnation. I think, by and large, we probably die once, go back to the spirit realm. What happens after that, I don't really think even the seers exactly know what the deal is. But I do think spiritual practice in this world will help improve the status of our souls in the hereafter.
That's a very good point, Scott. I mean, I hear a lot about how Celsus, the early Christian mystic and church father, believed in reincarnation. But that is wrong. He actually believed the same thing you just said, that we have one life on Earth, and it's in the spirit world that all these dimensions and evolutions happen. So that's very interesting. Oh, and for the listener, it's called The Great Courses, lecture with David Brackey. So the next question would be, how do we communicate with these spirits? And your view and experience and all the research you've done with different individuals, how do we get to talk to these spirits and gain some gnosis or avoid the bite of the bad ones?
Yeah, I think this is really important. My opinion, based on my experience, is that we should assume that doing spiritual work has some benefits for us, in part because not only the Gnostic seers, but the prophets and leaders of all religions have been able to get better access to guidance. I can say that I have kind of two sources for believing this is true. One is that as I've embarked on a period of prayer, I've devised my own little ritual. Now, I think if you can get to a Gnostic church or really any church or any center where there are rituals, whether it's yoga or the Mass at a Catholic church or anything, I think all these rituals will help you tune in to your spirit guides or your guardian angel, if you want to call them that. And I do a little ritual with a candle in which I pray to not only God the Father and Jesus the Liberator, but what I call the Holy Dead, those friends and ancestors who I think would wish me well. And I have to say that in terms of understanding things and getting some insights and the pieces of the cosmic puzzle falling together as I describe in the book, and the miracles in my life, it seems to work. And I do think that if you do spiritual work, it will improve your situation in the hereafter. That seems to be the consensus of the seers. Now, the seers in the Gnostic case have said that during the performance of the Mass, they can see a psychic energy building. If you really, I used to work for Fate magazine, and even though I'm a business reporter now, there are very few genuine psychics and mediums. But one of the people who has direct access to the spirit world happens to be my wife, Sandra Wells. I was hoping we'd have her on today, but we'll have to have her on another time because she's away. And
sounds like a plan.
From the beginning, when I met her, I knew she was the real deal, and I met her teacher, but she's had many very supernatural experiences. Part of it, I think, is due to the fact that she had 2 near-death experiences, and that does seem to change people in terms of their psychic ability. I don't think anybody should go out and nearly kill themselves to get there. However, she has been able to call down spirits, and she's told me some very hair-raising stories. And this was long before we had any relationship, so she wasn't trying to impress me. She was actually quite alarmed at the experiences initially. So I would say, pick your path, follow the rituals, and whatever they happen to be, I think they will help. I have participated in Jain temple worship in India. I've been to Zen centers in Tokyo. I've watched the whirling dervishes in Cairo. So, I can sense the presence of the spirit in all these places. So I think it commends spiritual work. Now, I will finally say this. If you do meditation, of any type, you're probably going to find all kinds of serendipities and synchronicities happening around you. The most dramatic one for me happened a few years ago, where I was driving through an intersection, and I was in a little Toyota Corolla, and an SUV plowed into the passenger side, totaled my car. I walked away barely harmed. Now, I was in a daze, and the driver of the SUV, who went through a red light, I realized was going to try to blame me and say I ran a red light. There was just one problem, namely that there was a pastor standing on the corner looking right at the impact point. He came over to me. He understood I was in shock, gave me his card. I called him the next day and said, hey, I can't remember what happened. He told me, and the guy, the other drivers scheme to, sue me and make me the bad guy, was foiled because this pastor had the courage to call my insurance company, and they said he was the most credible interview ever. Now, my life would have been in some ways ruined had he not been there. So do I think it was an accident that he just happened to be there? No. I think my guardian angels protected me, and I think that's the great value of spiritual work, that kind of experience and protection.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Although you could say, well, does dealing with the spirit world help us in the real world? Because some people immediately want to assume they get into that spiritual materialism. I'll ask the spirits to make me rich or get the girl or all that. But at the end of the day, it's all about the expansion of consciousness, right?
Yes, well, the search for truth is the big deal now. For better or worse, we have to live in this world, and I think that what you want ideally is to be able to bounce back from adversity. My day gig is I write a column for Investors Business Daily called Leaders in Success. I contribute twice a week. And what I interview people like I just did Richard Branson, Herbie Hancock, and I ask them, what's the secret of your success? What did you learn on the way up? And they all say the ability to be resilient, to overcome adversity. So it's not much about, piling up the goodies as it is, being able to survive the travails of life. And I think that if you follow any spiritual path, it gives you the bigger picture to kind of deal with that. But it's also good to cultivate the good spirits and your guardian angels because it may keep you out of some trouble.
Yeah, they may give you that gnosis that you need, like that pastor. You could have just ignored that advice. You could have ignored it right there. But it's interesting, and I'm sure Protestants will be not happy knowing that you can ask for the spirit world to intercede in your daily life. But that's another argument. And going back to your book, God Reconsidered, you say that you make the case that the new atheism is no more capable of providing a sound philosophy than tradition religions. What is the essence of your argument, Scott?
Yeah, I would say the thing that motivated me most to write God Reconsidered is irritation with the arrogant fools who run the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and the Skeptics Society. I used to deal with these people in Fate magazine, and they are as closed-minded, irrational, and zealous as any evangelical. And let's start with the fact that they're confusing atheism with materialism. They're not the same thing. For example, one of the chapters is on the evidence for ESP because the professional skeptics insist this has to be some kind of so-called paranormal skill, and therefore, since there is no supernatural, it can't be true. And I show, first of all, Freud, who was certainly a great atheist, he said, hey, I've had so many mind-reading experiences with my patients, I know this kind of thing exists. Well, today's militant skeptics, will have none of that. And then I go on to look at things that should be very easy for them to refute, UFO phenomenon, and then the evidence for afterlife. And what I show in these three chapters is that the militant atheist can't tell the truth. Every time you see a bold assertion by them, let's say that the near-death experiences can be explained by brain chemistry changes at the time of death, you go back and you look at the literature, and they're lying. I took 3 examples in the UFO phenomenon, and I went back and looked at the original reports, and then I went to their primary books on the subject, the skeptics' books, and in every single case, they twist the facts, misstate things. So I hope that these chapters will show people who are tempted by the notion that it's a godless universe and there's no supernatural, that they'll see that the evidence is otherwise. And there's a very delightful book by David Berlinski, a philosopher, called The Devil's Delusion, where he takes apart their philosophical arguments. And also, Michael Crichton, believe it or not, wrote a book called Travels with an appendix. The book is about his travels around the world and how he came across many things that his Harvard medical school training couldn't explain. So he was invited to talk about his ideas at the Skeptics Society until they found out what he was really going to say, which is the world is a much stranger place than, materialism can account for. So I know I got some flack on your YouTube channel from atheists who thought I was, not putting the evidence together fairly, and they hadn't read the book. So I would just say read the book, and the atheists speak for themselves, and you don't even have to argue with them. They're so wrong.
Yes, and for the listener, Scott gives more in our last interview. And, of course, you can read all the delightful YouTube comments. And speaking of those, you also got a little bit of flack for your criticisms of Eastern spiritual philosophies, which are generally viewed favorably relative to Western religions by those interested in esoteric traditions. How do you respond, or how did you respond as well, to those who think you were unfair?
Well, let me break this into two parts. First, Buddhism. As readers will discover, I'm not a big fan of Mahayana Buddhism for a number of reasons, including its emergence 600 years after the Buddha, and I don't think that the teachings of Mahayana reflect what the Buddha taught, the best we can determine. But the first problem with Buddhism is that there are so many completely contradictory sects. You have to say, what the hell is Buddhism? I mean, you have Jodo Shinshu, which says we're already enlightened, so there's really nothing to do. You have Zen, which says there's no difference between yourself and the rest of the universe, so, why strive to do anything? And I have been to Sarnath, India, to talk with the monks and the staff there. That's where the Buddha gave his first lecture about enlightenment. And as I said, I've been to Buddhist temples and Zen centers and so forth. Now, I know some of the readers thought, oh, you're being unfair. The Buddhist scholars have answers for your criticisms. Yeah, I've read them. I've read Ken Wilber, who is the most respected, I think, Eastern scholar in the U.S., but I do cite the Idiots and Dummies books for two reasons. Number one is they're actually written by great scholars in these traditions. Secondly, they blow less smoke, or at least it becomes clearer that that's what they're doing. Because one of my criticisms about Buddhism, as it's popularly discussed, is that they love to sound hip by making a really radical statement like, oh, there is no self. And then when you try to pin them down on why they're bothering to strive to do anything, then they back off and they say, oh, what we really mean is that the individual changes and, you're not the same person you were, before and that sort of thing. Well, so if they're not really stating anything very different from what we already know, why are they even making the point? This is a fairly typical thing that I encounter in Buddhist thinkers. Now, one of my things about the so-called no self is that, they say, well, we change. Yes, that's true. And something, our bodies are not the same as they were. They change all cells every 7 years, I believe. But, we not only would say that, the root of our body is still the same from childhood, but we have memories from childhood. It's not like, we can't remember what happened because we're a different person. There's a lot of evidence that we have a spirit and it survives, which I lay out in the chapter on afterlife. But just to be clear, Ken Wilber will say that kind of contrary to popular Mahayana practices, there is no self, according to the Buddha. The only thing that reincarnates is a magnetized set of karma. There's no memories. There's no personality. And anybody who thinks so really doesn't understand the Buddha. So there's no conventional reincarnation. Okay, now having ranted on that, let me just briefly talk about Hinduism. I actually have a great deal of respect for mainstream Hinduism. It's very shamanistic. I like the Hare Krishnas who represent mainstream Indian practice of Hinduism. Where I have a bone to pick, first of all, is with what's called Advaita Vedanta, the Shankara version, which is what's known in the U.S. because some of the early gurus came over here and they taught the idea that there is no individual self, there is only Brahman, the great, one being. And you'll just ignore my phone there.
It's the demiurge telling you to stop.
The thing about Advaita Vedanta is that it says all you have to do is come to the realization of the one. Well, first of all, is the Brahman schizophrenic that we even think we're individuals? And if so, why are we striving? We're not an individual. There's really nothing to do. So that's a problem, and I go into the illogic of this, which is pervasive in American Hinduism, but not typical of India. Secondly, I have a problem with reincarnation. Now, I know that my favorite groups, the Cathars and the Manichaeans, who I like partly because they showed how Gnosticism can play out in the real world. And I was an editor of Vegetarian Times, and they were vegetarian. And I love the face. Now, they both believed in reincarnation, and I'm not absolutely saying that it doesn't exist. However, I think that Gilles Quispel, the great Gnostic scholar who translated the Nag Hammadi text, put it best when he said, there may be reincarnation due to attachment in some cases, attachment by spirits to the world, but there's no karma. The problem with karma is it sounds like a solution to say, oh, you're having this bad luck in this life because of something bad you did in another life, but that doesn't really work. That doesn't solve the problem of the origin of why something is occurring. It just moves it back one step. And the problem with karma is that the more you think about the complexity of the world, if each person's karma had to be worked out, it would clash with every other individual's karma, and you end up not having to kind of freeze frame the entire universe for one individual to try to work out their karma. Now, Scott Rogel wrote a great book called The Search for Yesterday, in which he demolishes the popular evidence for reincarnation. So if readers don't take my word for it, they can read that book. And again, Gnostics aren't dogmatic about this sort of thing, but I don't really buy into reincarnation. I think if you do reincarnate, all you're doing is collecting a new set of dysfunctions. It's bad enough to be incarnated once. Second time is just going to put you backwards. And that's why nobody in India today would say that Indians are any more enlightened than they were 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, I would agree. I would certainly agree. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam embrace a similar concept of God as the Father. Scott, summarize for us your arguments in the book as why an all-powerful, all-knowing deity isn't compatible with a benevolent God who created humans to exercise free will to do good and evil.
Right. And you know, I fully understand how appealing this is, because when you're going through terrible experiences and you're having bad luck and so forth, and you look around in the world and you see a lot of suffering, you want to believe that there's a meaning for it all, and in the hereafter, God will explain it to us. But first of all, it's true that you can gain lessons from suffering. It's not without some value if you look at it a certain way. The problem is proportionality. I mean, a great deal of suffering has to do from nature. 250,000 people were killed by the tsunami. I don't believe for a second that they all had to be killed at the same moment because their karma was the same. I think that the Jews went to the gas chambers not because there were lessons to be learned. If they learned lessons, that was a sideshow to the suffering. The problem with the notion that we're here to exercise our God-given free will is that if anybody looks at the evidence, which I discuss in a chapter on the subject, they'll realize it's quite limited by our genetics, by our family background, social situation. I believe we have some free will. There's a new book out by Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit that shows that, you know, you can make an effort and kind of change your thinking about things, but our free will is clearly limited, as anybody can discover if they look into the evidence on this, which I discussed. Now, the central problem with the notion of divine foreknowledge is a lot of theists will say, well, listen, God isn't forcing us, to do anything. When he says that he can see the future, he's just foreseeing it. There's two problems with this. Number one, of course, if he created us, then he predetermined some of the outcome. And certainly we are limited in many ways by our background. But the problem with foreknowledge is that if it's 100% accurate, that if you can see in advance 10,000 years and you know absolutely that something's going to happen, then it can't change. There is no such thing as an exercise of will that will change the outcome. So that would be predestination. Maybe God doesn't actually cause the predestination, but nature, genetics, family background do. I don't believe that that's the case. I do think we have some free will. I don't think the outcome is entirely predetermined. But when people say that absolute foreknowledge by God, 100% accuracy, and free will are compatible, they really haven't thought through the evidence, and they can read my chapter and make their own judgment about that.
But Scott, if these points are so obvious, why do intelligent people fail to recognize the contradictions?
Well, I'm in the business of interviewing top CEOs, so I know a lot about really, really smart people. And certainly the militant skeptics like Michael Shermer and James Randi and some of these other guys, they're very bright. They certainly will know more about science than I'll ever understand and so forth. But there's a lot of arrogance that goes along with it, and smart people think that they know all the answers. Now, part of the issue is that as human beings, we're very good at compartmentalizing things. This helps us with homeostasis, which is kind of going back to our default position of comfort. And they've done studies which, believe it or not, show that almost any tragedy, whether it is divorce, a death in the family, even the Holocaust, that human beings are incredibly adaptable. They put the horrible experiences in a box, lock it away. They learn to cope under the most adverse conditions. And within 3 months on average, they get back to the point where they can live life again. Now, anybody who, let's say, had a love of their life, their soulmate early on, and then it didn't work out, for a few months it was agony, especially if you're young. And that remarkably, years later, you look back and you think, what the hell was that even about? I guess it was nature driving the hormones to propagate the species. So it's very hard for people to kind of fully face the suffering in the world. So I really put everybody's face into that, and I remind everybody in a very difficult early chapter of what history was really like. 50% infant mortality rate, a tremendous suffering from, the Black Death killed off about 40% of Europe at the time. And you cannot say that, something like cancer suffering is offset by the lessons learned. So a lot of it is just our willful ignorance, our ignorance of history and prehistory and the way things were before. We don't really want to face the notion that God was responsible for all that. And the biggest problem with the world that it's very hard to get your mind around is how random and chaotic it is.
But Scott, it's one thing to criticize other faiths, but why do you think Gnosticism offers a variable alternative?
Well, yes, that's a great question. And, I don't want to just be tearing down other space. Incidentally, the God Reconsidered has posted at godreconsidered.com my preface, which is called a forewarning instead of the traditional foreword. And what I say is, listen, if you are comfortable with your faith, literally, God bless you, and don't read this book. Now, some people may think this is some kind of gimmick like Abby Hoffman's Don't Steal This Book. If you remember years ago, that probably made it a bestseller or maybe the best stolen book. I don't know. But I'm sincere in saying, look, I realized that raising these issues about why there cannot be a benevolent creator and the suffering that goes back to the dinosaurs, if you want to really look at the bigger picture, that these are uncomfortable things. So what I'm saying is, if you are not satisfied with your path, if you don't really feel at peace, then Gnosticism has something to offer. The number one thing is how it differs from every other religion, and I've looked at all of them virtually, is it's not lying about the nature of this world. It will not tell you the big lie that God intended us to be here so we could learn lessons, and that he's guiding our lives and everything is meant to be, and what looks bad is really good. We just don't have the eternal perspective and all that kind of stuff. Gnosticism says the creator of this world is evil, not was evil, is evil, an active force. And you might ask, well, why would anybody be so sadistic? Why would anybody, want to have these pawns worshiping him? And as I said, look at Stalin. If there's a Stalin in this world, or a Mao Zedong or a Hitler, why should the spirit world be any different?
As below as above, like the taking from the Hermetics.
Yeah, and that's a kind of a tough thing to get your head around. But the fact is, not only does Gnosticism say there's a duality in reality, and it's really the only one willing to basically not blame the good God, the God above that Gnostics believe in, for the evil of this world, but it does also say that this creation was an accident. Now, there's a book out I mentioned in God Reconsidered called Lucky Planet, which makes the argument that the reason we haven't found another planet in the universe with life on it, as far as we know, is because we're unique. There isn't one. Now, maybe that will ultimately turn out to be not the case, but the reality is we certainly are rare. And Gnosticism says in its myths that the creation of this world was an accident that was basically exploited by this evil spirit, the demiurge. And that, to me, that recognition of the duality of reality and the evil of creation is the beginning of wisdom. Now, Gnosticism does offer a very exciting, positive spiritual path, and it's not dogmatic. There's all kinds of variations, and you can pick whatever one you want. I'm more of a dualist than some of the Valentinians, and I'm less of a New Ager than some of those who would, like to kind of believe in the secret or something like that. But it offers a variety of flavors. It's a fascinating mixture, but basically Gnostics are kind of united around that notion that our home is not here, and we should make the best of it while we're here. I mean, as I mentioned about being vegetarian, I think there's not only ethical reasons, I think there's good health reasons to take care of your body. We have a body, let's take care of it. It's not really a paradox to say, let's enjoy ourselves, let's enjoy life, and let's keep the bigger picture in mind, and also follow some spiritual practices to keep us stable while we're dealing with worldly adversity.
But Scott, what would you say to those who argue that there is a God, this alien God, this unknown God? He would be helping us get the hell out on Earth. That's a question I get on too. Why doesn't he just come and take us back to the pleroma?
Yeah. Why haven't the aliens landed and taken us to the other planet? Well, let's look at this in a slightly different way. I think that you could argue that the world has been getting somewhat better. I mean, we don't have the Black Plague. We don't have a 50% infant mortality rate. We haven't had a global conflict since World War II. And incidentally, I write a lot about history, and Americans are woefully ignorant about things even like World War II, which they should know about. They don't even know anything really about the Civil War. So today we are very, very blessed with things we take for granted, including our health. I'm not a fan of modern medicine, but we certainly have a lot of good alternative medicines. And my point is simply that the world really isn't in many ways nearly as bad as it was. And that would argue for what the Gnostics say, and certainly the Manichaeans, is a balance of power. That, as the Manichaeans would say, light and darkness have been struggling for supremacy from the beginning, as far back as anybody knows. I think that you wouldn't necessarily have to follow Manichaean practices in order to do your part, but I do think spiritual work kind of offsets that. And I think that it may be that perhaps for elevated spiritual beings, especially impersonal beings as the absolute God, the God above God, may be, that it's not really desirable for the spirits to come into this world. Maybe this is the entire world may be like an Ebola zone for spirits, and we don't really know exactly why they're not more powerful, but they seem to do a job of fending off the demiurge or Jehovah coming to us and turning everybody into fundamentalist Jews, or Allah has not been able to appear to anybody other than Muhammad and threaten everybody with death if they don't worship him. So it appears that there's a struggle going on between the good and the evil spirits, and why we don't get more help is one of the questions that we don't have an absolute answer for. But I believe in a shamanistic Gnosticism where, you can make your own blessings. You can pray to the God above God, to Jesus, the liberator, to the guardian angels, and to what I call the holy dead, those who wish you well. And you can try to do the rituals that will raise your consciousness and help the world around you, and it may do some good. And we don't have to have all the answers to be able to follow a spiritual path.
And what about those who think the gods are aliens who periodically appear in history, the UFOs, so forth?
Yeah, I've studied this very, very extensively, and I agree with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who wrote Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he came to the point in studying the subject, in particular abductions, that it can become so disturbing. You get into this kind of hall of mirrors where you begin to question your sanity. I think that the aliens and UFOs are a real phenomenon, but probably of mixed origin. Some of them might be ETs from other planets. The UFO phenomenon has been very clearly associated with religion, like the Virgin Mary apparition. Scott Rogo's book Miracles goes to this in quite a bit of detail. But one of the interesting things is that the spectacular UFO public sightings and encounters and the abduction phenomenon have faded. They're not what they were in the 50s through even the 80s. And I'm not sure of the reason for that, but maybe it's connected with the fact that there is a better process for the good spirits to kind of keep us from being manipulated. I would not recommend that people look deeply into the abduction business, quite frankly. But I certainly don't believe that the aliens are our saviors. They're, the eons, the angelic beings, and they're here to save us. I think, if anything, they are either neutral visitors from other planets or emissaries of the evil demiurge.
And going back to the theme of the afterlife, what we touched upon, and of course it's an important one, could you tell us a bit more, Scott, what we should expect when we kick the bucket?
Well, first of all, again, I don't think we should be eager to do so. I think that while we're here, let's make the best of it. And, I know that some Gnostics have preached, why don't you just jump into the next dimension where you belong? But I think that raises a number of ethical questions, and we should be conservative and prudent about those things. I think that my opinion, not shared by most Gnostics, is that the transition to the other life is the liberation, that we're not going to come back. As I've said, from everything we can tell, all the prophets and seers contradict each other about the details of what happens other than survival. That there is an afterlife, I argue in my book. We do survive. I think the higher animals at least survive. What happens after that, I don't know. But I do believe that spiritual practices will make it more likely that you will reach the pleroma or heaven or the more enlightened realm. So I think it is a good idea to do whatever spiritual practices you may find amenable to your path. Does anybody come back? Maybe there's a reason. I mean, very, very few people who have near-death experiences are sent back. Maybe there's a reason for them to come back here for personal reasons. Maybe they have a message, but very few percentage-wise of the people who die, have these near-death experiences. So I don't think our purpose really is in this world. But I also know that we have a limited understanding of what happens, and we shouldn't get too hung up on it. We don't have to have all the answers to live a spiritual life and to look forward to liberation at the time of death.
So that opens the question. I know you're saying don't get too hung up on it, but some people may be going, so there's a possibility that there are lower spiritual realms with little demons and pitchforks.
I would argue, as I do in the book, that there's probably no hell. However, people do bring their own hell with them, and I do think that people will become, most likely, according to what we see with the near-death experiences where there's a review of life, I do think that we will become conscious of memories we've suppressed, and we'll have a better perspective on what would have been the right way to live and this sort of thing. And some people probably will go through, a hellish experience trying to reconcile their behavior with their higher self. Beyond that, eternal damnation really doesn't make any sense if you didn't happen to be baptized into, the Baptist or Catholic Church at the right time, or, you live before those churches are around. The whole concept of the fundamentalist Christian hell makes absolutely no sense for a loving God who created these beings to begin with. And but I don't necessarily think that we automatically have a blissful eternity just because we die.
And I guess it gives a little bit of insight into the idea of purgatory or purgation of the Catholics. But again, that's another topic. And to end, Scott, how do you define Gnosis, and what does it mean in terms of daily life and the hereafter?
I would say that Gnosis is the spiritual insight, as the Nag Hammadi scriptures say, into where we came from, why we're here, and where our true home is, that recognizing the duality of life, that the creator of this world is not the great higher God, and that we owe it to ourselves and those around us to become involved in spiritual practice, that insight, whether it's sudden, as in my case, or whether it is in most cases probably something you come to realize over time, it reduces your anxiety about the importance of success in this world and achieving your goals and all that stuff. It gives you the eternal perspective, and it makes you less anxious that there is a Jehovah, Allah, God the Father on the other side with a whip, and the devil with his pitchfork, ready to pounce on you and, put you through a horrible experience because you didn't espouse the exact credo. And, liberation from that anxiety about the truth, I think, brings inner peace. And that's ultimately the blessing of Gnosis and a prelude to the liberation by death.
Very well said, or I like to say, a little bit of spiritual elbow room is a good thing in our daily lives. But I think that's all the time we have today, Scott, and we definitely look forward to the next time when Sandra can join us and we can expand more on talking to spirits. And again, thank you very much for coming on a second time and discussing your book, God Reconsidered.
And thanks, Miguel, and go to godreconsidered.com if you want to ask me any questions. I'll respond.
Yes, or make sure to write some lovely comments on the YouTube channel. Scott will be there.
Thanks, Miguel.